David Carter stepped onto the jet bridge with a steady stride, his polished shoes tapping softly on the sleek surface. The hum of the airport's bustling terminal seemed a world away as he made his way toward the sleek first-class cabin of Horizon Airways Flight 119, bound for New York. His charcoal suit, tailored perfectly to his broad frame, hugged him like it had been made for no one else. Every step he took exuded quiet confidence. A man who had earned his place and wore his success like a second skin without ever needing to flaunt it. His leather briefcase swung gently in his hand, the polished brass clasp gleaming beneath the soft cabin lighting. The subtle scent of cedarwood lingered around him, a reminder of the brand he'd built. Reliable, understated, but unmistakably expensive. The first-class cabin ahead seemed like a cocoon of luxury, a world that only the top tier of travelers inhabited. He was accustomed to this, the soft clinking of champagne flutes, the gentle murmur of elite travelers making small talk. But today it was different. Today he was stepping into a storm. As David moved toward his seat, he could feel eyes on him, a mixture of curiosity and judgment from the other passengers. It was the usual look, just enough of a glance to tell him that they were trying to figure out who he was, what his story was. Was he an outsider? Was he one of them? He had seen this look before, countless times, and it didn't faze him. His seat, 1B, was situated at the front of the cabin, just the way he liked it. Space, comfort, and a view. But before he could reach it, his journey hit its first bump. At the galley entrance stood Rachel Brooks, the lead flight attendant. She was impeccably put together, as expected, her blonde hair pulled back tightly, her blue eyes scanning the cabin with the sort of precision reserved for those who ran the show. When she saw him, her gaze flicked over him in a way that wasn't exactly welcoming, but more like she was assessing whether he belonged here. And as her lips curled into something resembling a smile, it was clear that she had already made up her mind. "First class isn't what it used to be," Rachel muttered, just loud enough for the junior attendant beside her to hear. The young man, no more than 20, snickered nervously, glancing at David like he was some sort of curiosity. It didn't take a genius to know what she meant. She was judging him, and not just based on his attire, but on something deeper. The weight of her gaze lingered for a moment longer than it should have. David stood there for a beat, expression neutral. Years of boardroom poker had taught him the value of staying calm in the face of subtle jabs. "Is there a problem?" he asked, keeping his tone low, measured. Rachel glanced down at his boarding pass, snatching it from his hand with a flick of her wrist, as if she were handling something dirty. She scanned it briefly before holding it up to the light, squinting at it like she was inspecting a counterfeit. "This looks off," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. "Let me see it again." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a brief moment, there was something calculating in them. David raised an eyebrow. "The scanner's working, isn't it?" Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she waved over the junior attendant, who fumbled with the handheld scanner. The green light flashed, the familiar beep echoing in the quiet cabin. The boarding pass was legit, but Rachel wasn't done. She pressed the attendant again, forcing the scan to be repeated. The same result. "Valid," the young man muttered, but Rachel, not one to back down, held her ground. "Do it again. Something's off." Around them, passengers were starting to take notice. A man in a pinstripe suit a few rows back leaned forward to whisper to his friend, a smirk playing on his lips. A woman with a pearl necklace clutching her purse tighter, eyes darting nervously between David and Rachel, as if expecting a confrontation. But nobody said a word. They just watched, waiting for something to unfold as if they were watching a scene in a play, and David was the star who didn't belong. "Fine," David said, keeping his voice calm. "You've got your answer." He tucked the boarding pass into his pocket and turned toward his seat. The tension in the cabin was palpable, but David wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. He hadn't even reached 1 billion yet, but already Rachel had made it clear he wasn't welcome here. He moved toward the row, feeling the weight of the passengers' stares on his back. He could feel the faint trace of Rachel's eyes, boring into him, but he didn't give her the satisfaction of looking back. He reached the overhead bin, opening it with a smooth motion, preparing to stow his briefcase, when Rachel's voice stopped him, dead in his tracks. David paused, his hand still on the overhead bin, as Rachel's voice sliced through the stillness of the cabin. "Hold up," she said, her tone as sharp as a knife, and he could hear the authority in it, the sort of voice that demanded attention. He turned to face her, already bracing for the next round. She was standing there a few feet away, her hands on her hips, her face a picture of cold professionalism. The usual polite smile had disappeared, replaced by a steely expression that only further fueled his irritation. "I need you to keep that with you," Rachel insisted, her voice firm, her eyes never leaving him. David glanced at his briefcase, the leather gleaming even in the soft cabin lighting. He was about to argue, about to point out that there was plenty of space in the bin, but he saw the gleam in her eye. A challenge, a test. He fought the urge to snap back. "The plane hasn't even finished boarding yet," he said, his tone still steady. "There's room, plenty of room." The words left his mouth like a calm breeze, but Rachel wasn't having it. She stepped forward, her heel clicking against the floor with purpose. "Regulations," she said, her smile thin and biting. "We close the overhead bins 10 minutes before final prep for safety. It's standard procedure." She waved her hand dismissively, as if she were speaking to a child who needed to be told the rules again. "You'll have to keep it under the seat. I'm sure you'll manage." David exhaled through his nose, the sharp edge of her condescension gnawing at his patience. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, watching, waiting for him to crack. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Not here, not now. He moved his briefcase from the bin, its heavy leather creaking under the shift, and placed it carefully at his feet. The cramped space was uncomfortable, but at least it was his choice, not hers. As he settled into 1B, the soft leather of the seat cradling him like an old friend, he could still feel her eyes burning into his back. He didn't look. He didn't have to. Rachel, with her false smile, turned on her heel and strutted back toward the galley. Her posture was perfect, back straight, chin held high, as though she had won. And in her mind, she had. She had made her point, and she was satisfied. But David wasn't so sure. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft clink of champagne flutes from a few rows back. The cabin was slowly filling up now, with passengers settling into their seats, making small talk and arranging their belongings. The noise of the plane taxiing down the runway, the engines beginning to rumble, only added to the tension in the air. David adjusted the strap of his briefcase, still perched on the floor in front of him. The weight of it was starting to press into his legs, but he didn't care. It wasn't the briefcase that was causing the discomfort. It was the feeling in his chest, the feeling that this wasn't going to be a smooth flight. As he glanced out the window, watching the tarmac stretch out under the fading Los Angeles sunset, a sharp voice cut through the ambient chatter. "Mr. Carter?" A voice, soft but firm, interrupted his moment of quiet contemplation. David turned, his eyes narrowing slightly. Another passenger was approaching, his demeanor just a little too eager. It was the man in the pinstripe suit from earlier. "I hope you're not causing any trouble," the man said, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. The insinuation was clear, a thinly veiled jab, just like Rachel's earlier comment. David's pulse quickened, his chest tightening. He could feel the anger building, but he kept it in check. He had to. He didn't want to give anyone else the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "I'm just trying to get to New York," David replied, his voice cool, but with an underlying edge. He wasn't going to let the man provoke him. Not here, not now. The man chuckled, clearly enjoying the tension. "Just saying, people like you don't usually get this kind of seat." David's hand clenched at the armrest. His first instinct was to snap back, to put the man in his place, but he didn't. He wouldn't. He was better than that. He had worked too hard to get here, to let some stranger tear him down with casual words and prejudice. Instead, he straightened in his seat, shoulders back, eyes focused straight ahead. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The flight would pass. The merger would be finalized in New York. And Rachel and her little band of silent judges, wouldn't matter, not for long. He could feel the sting of the words, but he could also feel the quiet resolve in his chest. No one, not Rachel, not this man, could take that away from him, not if he didn't let them. The plane rumbled forward, its engines growing louder, as Horizon Airways Flight 119 began its ascent from the Los Angeles tarmac. David Carter shifted in his seat, feeling the familiar pressure on his chest as the plane picked up speed. The window beside him blurred into streaks of orange and purple from the setting sun, and for a moment he closed his eyes, trying to breathe deeply and focus. It wasn't supposed to be like this. His fingers drummed lightly against the leather armrest, the weight of the briefcase at his feet still digging into his thighs. The merger documents, his lifeline, sat inside, the deal that could reshape the airline industry, the one he'd spent months finalizing. He could already hear the voices of the other board members, the promises of untold profits, the recognition. New York was only a few hours away, but that was before Rachel Brooks, before the scrutiny, before the subtle jabs. His thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendants began their usual pre-flight rituals, offering drinks, organizing the cabin, ensuring everyone was settled. David had barely noticed when one of the attendants had slid by earlier, offering him a glass of water, but now it was hard to ignore the stark difference in treatment compared to the others. He wasn't being treated like the executive he was, but rather an outsider, a trespasser. David shifted again, attempting to stretch his legs in the confined space. The seat was too small, the briefcase too heavy, and the glances from the other passengers too pointed. It felt as though he was being put on display, his every movement watched, judged. It was a familiar feeling, one he had dealt with for years in boardrooms and business meetings. But here, on the flight, with nothing more than a few feet of space separating him from strangers, it felt more suffocating. He glanced to the side, catching sight of the passenger sitting 2 rows ahead. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a sharp navy suit and an air of quiet confidence that somehow seemed out of place in the crowded cabin. The man was watching him from the corner of his eye, no doubt sizing him up, like the rest of the passengers. David knew the look all too well. He had worn it himself, just as often as he had been its target. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, on the cusp of securing a $500 million deal, and yet all that anyone saw was the man sitting in the wrong seat, the outsider. The flight attendant, Rachel, appeared again at the front of the cabin, this time not to deliver drinks or assist passengers. Her cold blue eyes scanned the rows, her gaze resting briefly on David before moving on to other business. She seemed to be everywhere, watching, judging, waiting for another opportunity to assert her authority. Her earlier treatment of him, the way she questioned his boarding pass, the dismissive way she shut the overhead bin, it all lingered in the back of his mind. David gritted his teeth, trying to shake the irritation off. He knew what this was, another test of his worth, another attempt to push him into a box he didn't belong in. She had made her assessment. Now it was time for him to prove her wrong. The lights dimmed as the plane continued its climb, and the usual hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm. David closed his eyes again, forcing his mind back to the merger. He needed to focus. He couldn't afford to let distractions or petty squabbles get in the way of his goal. But just as he was about to pull out his tablet, something caught his eye, a movement, a flicker of motion. Rachel was at the galley talking to another flight attendant, but she wasn't speaking in the normal tones of the pre-flight routine. Her voice, though low, carried enough for David to catch a few words. "Unbelievable," she muttered, her tone dripping with disdain. "I don't know how they let people like him up here." David froze, the words cutting through him, sharper than any direct confrontation. He tried to ignore it, tried to push it out of his mind, but it was impossible. He knew exactly who she was talking about. The outsider, the man who didn't belong. He clenched his jaw and looked out the window, his hands steady despite the rising tide of frustration. It was happening again. The subtle discrimination, the implication that, because of his appearance, he couldn't possibly deserve to be in the same place as the others, the same place as them. David's mind raced. He could feel the burn of her words lingering in the air, thick and suffocating. People like him. What did that mean? He knew what she meant. She didn't need to say more. He had encountered it his entire life, the quiet bias that people tried to hide behind smiles and polished manners. The idea that someone like him, a black man, a man who had worked tirelessly to reach the heights he had, didn't belong in these spaces, didn't deserve to sit in a seat paid for with his own money, his own hard work. But the thing about David was that he didn't react the way people expected. He'd learned long ago that confrontation wasn't always the answer. There was power in restraint, power in remaining calm when others would lose control. It made them nervous. It made them second-guess their assumptions. Still, the sting of Rachel's words was like a fresh wound, one he couldn't immediately heal. He let out a slow breath, willing the anger to subside, but the feeling was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. Rachel's voice cut through his thoughts again, this time louder, like she was trying to make sure everyone could hear her. "I swear this is what's wrong with first class these days," she said, shaking her head in disbelief as she spoke to another attendant nearby. David caught her eye, but this time there was no pretense of politeness. It was all disdain, raw, unfiltered. David's grip tightened on the armrest. His patience was wearing thin, and yet he didn't move. He knew the drill. He had to stay composed. Every moment of weakness, every hint of a crack in his facade, would only fuel the fire. The minutes dragged on. The flight attendants continued their work, serving drinks, greeting passengers, going about their business. But David couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing in the background, the way the passengers were starting to look at him, the way their whispers had begun to rise, subtly at first but growing more distinct. A man in a crisp suit a few rows ahead of him leaned toward his companion and muttered something just loud enough for David to hear. "Bet he's not supposed to be in first class," the man said with a quiet laugh. His words were innocently casual, but the intent behind them was clear. It was another reminder that David wasn't one of them. He wasn't the kind of person who was supposed to occupy a seat like this. David tried to ignore it. He focused on the sound of the engines, the rhythmic hum that usually calmed him. But tonight, it was only a reminder of the noise growing around him, inside the cabin, in his mind. The whispers, the judgment, and worst of all, the feeling of being trapped. The plane leveled out, and the seatbelt sign flickered off. The cabin seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as passengers shifted in their seats. Some reclined their chairs, others pulled out books or screens, eager to begin their in-flight entertainment. But David felt more like a spectator than a participant in this moment. His attention was drawn back to Rachel, who had reappeared at the front of the cabin, her eyes scanning the room, landing briefly on him again before moving on. It was like a game to her now, he realized. She was watching him, evaluating every move, waiting for him to slip up. And he couldn't afford that. Not now. Not when everything was riding on this flight, on this deal. He had worked too damn hard to let one petty interaction derail everything. David was about to open his tablet when Rachel reappeared at his side, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached. Her eyes met his briefly, and for a moment he wondered if she was about to apologize, if maybe she realized how far she'd crossed the line. But no. Instead, she crossed her arms, her expression stiff. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clipped and formal, "I'm afraid we have a small issue. It seems your seat has been double booked." Her words were polite on the surface, but there was something underneath them, something almost triumphant, like she'd found a new way to make him feel like an outsider. David blinked, taken aback. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago," he said, pulling out his boarding pass, still crisp and unmarked. "This is my seat. No upgrades, no changes." Rachel gave him a look, her head tilting slightly as if humoring him. "Well, the system says otherwise," she replied, tapping at her tablet, her finger scrolling down quickly, making it seem like she was doing everything by the book. "It says you'll need to move to 9C. David's eyes narrowed. 9C? He repeated, his voice steady but the disbelief creeping in. "That's a middle seat, 3 rows back. You're telling me that after all the trouble with my boarding pass, you expect me to move back there?" Rachel didn't flinch. "I'm afraid so. FAA regulations. We can't have 2 passengers in the same seat, Mr. Carter. It's just a formality." David held her gaze, his fingers tightening around the edge of his tablet. He knew exactly what was going on. It wasn't about the seat. It was about power, about control. She was pushing him, testing how far he would let her go. "I'm not moving," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "Scan it again. You'll see it's all in order." David leaned back in his seat, his jaw clenched as Rachel turned and walked away, her heels clicking with each step like the ticking of a clock. The cabin was still, but David could feel the tension mounting with every passing moment. The other passengers, once casually settling in for a routine flight, were now subtly aware of the scene unfolding. Whispers started to drift through the aisles, light and distant at first, but becoming more pronounced as the minutes passed. David stared straight ahead, his hands resting on the armrest, palms flat. His mind was racing, but outwardly, he was calm. He had faced worse than this. He had been in boardrooms where the stakes were higher, where the people across from him had tried to undermine him with far sharper weapons. A glance, a word, a disapproving look. This question, Mark, this was nothing. But then again, it was something. He knew it. Something about this felt different. Rachel's words had cut deeper than any formal dismissal or sharp remark he had faced before. She wasn't just questioning his right to sit in a first-class seat. She was questioning his very existence in this space, a space he had fought for. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about power. The engine noise grew louder as the plane climbed higher, the hum vibrating through the floor. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the briefcase digging into his thighs, a heavy reminder of the work that had brought him to this point. A $500 million deal was waiting for him in New York, but none of it seemed to matter. Not in the moment. Not when he was being reduced to a stereotype, a token of sorts. Just another outsider who didn't belong in the world of privilege that surrounded him. The sting of Rachel's insinuations was still fresh in his mind when the drink cart made its way down the aisle, rolling smoothly over the polished floor. David watched as it passed by, eyes briefly meeting those of the attendant pushing it. She gave him a polite smile, but it was the kind of smile that was just a little too rehearsed, too forced, like she was apologizing for the wrongs of another, even though she hadn't been part of it. A moment later, Rachel appeared again, this time with a clipboard in her hands. She looked calm, but David could see the subtle tension in her posture, the way she held herself, like she was expecting trouble, like she was bracing for a fight. She stopped at the row beside him, her eyes flicking over him briefly before she looked down at the papers on her clipboard. "Mr. Carter," Rachel said, her voice professional, but there was an edge to it. "I just wanted to remind you of the airline's policies regarding personal items." She glanced briefly at his briefcase. "I'm afraid it has to be stored under the seat, as previously mentioned." David blinked, momentarily thrown by the return of the conversation. She was back again, still pressing, still finding ways to make his presence feel like an inconvenience. It wasn't about the briefcase anymore. It was about control. "I'm aware of the policy," David said, his voice steady but edged with an unspoken challenge, "and I've already complied. The bag's under my seat." Rachel's eyes flicked down to the briefcase at his feet, then back up to meet his gaze, as though she was looking for something, anything to pick apart. She stepped back slightly, but not before glancing over her shoulder toward the galley, as if gauging the reactions of the other passengers. David followed her gaze and saw the woman with the pearl necklace, the one who had been eyeing him earlier, her fingers nervously clutching the leather strap of her purse. He knew what she was thinking. She was part of the silent audience, the one who would judge him without ever saying a word. Rachel didn't say anything for a moment, but her silence spoke volumes. It was a look that David recognized well, the kind of look that told you everything about how she viewed you. It wasn't subtle, but it didn't have to be. She wasn't concerned with appearances or professionalism. She was just trying to remind him of his place, and he couldn't help but wonder, was she doing this just to put him in his place? Or was it something deeper? "I'll let you get settled then," Rachel said, her tone shifting slightly, though the words felt empty. There was no apology in her voice, no concession. Only the expectation that he would play along with the game she was setting up. She turned on her heel, leaving him once again in the midst of a growing storm of eyes and whispers. David sank back into his seat, trying to push the tension out of his mind, trying to focus on the things that mattered. He had a deal to close. He had to focus on the merger, New York, the future. But Rachel wasn't done yet. David settled into his seat, the hum of the engines and the flickering cabin lights almost lulling him into a sense of calm. He reached for his briefcase, now tucked securely under the seat, and began to pull out the tablet with the merger documents. He needed to focus. He needed to block out everything else, the stares, the whispers, the subtle digs, and dive into the work that had brought him here. The future of his career was at stake. His focus had to be unwavering, but Rachel's words still echoed in his mind. The insinuation that he didn't belong here, that someone like him wasn't supposed to be in first class, had wormed its way into his thoughts. It was a silent battle now, one that didn't involve words, but the kind of subtle power struggle that often ran beneath the surface of interactions like these. The kind where the rules didn't matter, where what you had on paper, your accomplishments, your hard-earned success, didn't matter. It was about perception, it was about power, and Rachel had made it clear. She was playing for power. David glanced around, noticing that the attention of the cabin had shifted again, like a ripple spreading from one person to the next. People weren't just pretending anymore. They were openly watching. Rachel had created a spectacle, and everyone in the cabin had a front row seat. His every move was being observed, scrutinized. And the worst part? He couldn't do anything about it, not without making it worse. His hand hovered over the tablet screen, but he couldn't focus on the numbers, the strategy, the contract clauses. Not now, not while Rachel was still out there, subtly manipulating the situation in the background. The subtle hints of racism were seeping through, like cracks in the foundation of what should have been a professional exchange. Just as David was about to tap open his email, the door to the galley swung open, and Rachel emerged again, this time with a tray of drinks. She approached him with that same perfect smile plastered on her face, a smile that seemed to say, "I'm doing my job, but I'm also watching you." "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone syrupy sweet, far too sweet for someone who had just made him the target of a public spectacle. "Would you like something to drink? We have a fine selection of wines, or perhaps some champagne to make your flight more enjoyable?" David's eyes flicked to the tray, then to her face. He wasn't going to let her get under his skin. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "No, thank you," he said, keeping his voice calm and composed. "I'm good." Rachel hesitated for a moment, clearly expecting a different answer, maybe one that would give her an opening to continue the interaction. But when she saw that David wasn't playing along, she nodded stiffly and moved on to the next passenger, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. David watched her go, his mind still reeling. She wasn't done with him yet. He knew that for sure. And as much as he tried to focus on the merger, on the numbers and strategy that had gotten him this far, he couldn't help but feel that Rachel had crossed a line. She had made this personal. It wasn't just about the seat or the briefcase anymore. It was about something far uglier, something he had fought against for his entire life. The idea that no matter what he achieved, no matter how much he proved himself, there would always be someone ready to tear him down. His grip tightened on the tablet. He had to rise above this. The merger, the deal, his future. That's what mattered. Not Rachel, not the passengers, not the whispers. But as the plane continued its climb into the sky, David knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Rachel had started a game, and now David was going to play it on his terms. The plane leveled out, and the cabin settled into a hum of quiet chatter. Drinks were served, and people began to relax, settling into the luxury of their first-class seats. But David wasn't done. Not yet. He knew that the next few hours would be critical. He would have to make his move, his counterattack, and do it with the same quiet strength he had built his entire life on. But Rachel was already planning her next move. He could feel it, and he had no intention of letting her win. David's eyes flickered to the overhead compartment, his briefcase now securely stored under his seat as per Rachel's insistence. He had tried to let it go, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Rachel's cold treatment, the subtle and not-so-subtle jabs from other passengers, the quiet whispers. It was all too much to ignore. The cabin felt smaller than ever, and no matter how much he tried to drown out the noise, it followed him like a shadow. As the plane soared higher, the lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines took on a soft, rhythmic lull, almost lulling the passengers into a false sense of calm. David glanced around. Most people had settled into their comfort zones, distracted by their drinks, books, or the slow drone of the flight attendants working the aisles. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. He could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, the way eyes lingered just a moment too long on him. Rachel passed by again, her movements sharp and deliberate as she delivered drinks to the front rows. Her eyes never met his directly this time. She had a way of making her presence felt without having to speak. She was always watching, always waiting for the moment when he might slip up, when he might give her the opening she was craving. David's grip on the armrest tightened, but he forced himself to relax. This wasn't the time to make a scene, not now, not with everything on the line. His merger, his career, was too important to let a petty power struggle derail him. But there was something else, something he wasn't willing to ignore. Rachel had crossed a line. She wasn't just trying to put him in his place anymore. She was actively making it difficult for him to stay composed, to stay focused. The subtle slights, insisting on the briefcase being under the seat, the questioning of his boarding pass, the whispers, were beginning to feel like a calculated attempt to unsettle him. David glanced at the passengers around him, noticing how a few of them kept glancing in his direction. There was a woman a few rows ahead, her pearl necklace gleaming in the dim light, her purse clutched tightly in her lap as if she were trying to protect herself from the chaos that David was supposedly causing. Behind him, a man in a pinstripe suit made no attempt to hide his curiosity. He'd already made a comment earlier about how people like David didn't usually end up in first class. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, but David couldn't afford to show it. Not here, not now. He had to play it cool. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. The merger he was working on had the potential to reshape the entire airline industry. Every moment he wasted in this childish power struggle was another moment that could cost him everything. As he opened his tablet again, hoping to lose himself in the merger details, he caught Rachel's gaze across the cabin. She was standing in the galley now, her back turned slightly to him, but she was looking at him, watching him. Her posture was perfect, as always, but there was something in her eyes, a glint of something that made David pause. She was waiting for him to react, waiting for him to crack, and that's when he realized it. Rachel wasn't just testing him. She was trying to break him. The realization hit him like a cold wave. He wasn't just in a battle for respect anymore. This wasn't just about who belonged in first class. This was personal for Rachel. She wanted to tear him down, to humiliate him. The next few hours would determine everything. David knew it was only a matter of time before Rachel made her next move. David exhaled slowly, trying to push the rising frustration out of his chest. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to make him feel small, to question his place in spaces that were meant for people with power and influence. He'd worked his entire life to get here, to prove to himself and everyone else that he belonged. But with Rachel's subtle taunts, with the whispers that filled the air around him, he was beginning to feel like he was back in high school, sitting in the back of the classroom, trying to avoid the stares. But this was no high school. This was a flight to New York, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel like he didn't belong. The plane was now cruising at altitude, and the cabin had settled into a lull, passengers relaxing, the buzz of the engines mixing with the soft clink of champagne flutes. David tried to focus on the tablet in front of him. He needed to finish reviewing the merger documents to keep his mind on the deal and off the games Rachel was playing. But the distraction was unbearable. Every few seconds, he felt Rachel's gaze on him, even though she wasn't physically in his sight. She was out of his direct line of view, but somehow it felt like she was right there, standing over him, watching him. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He tucked the tablet away, leaned back in his seat, and closed his eyes for a moment. He needed a break. He needed to clear his mind. The flight was going to take a few hours, and he knew Rachel wasn't going to stop. She had made her move, but David wasn't going to be the one to blink first. The game had just begun, and he was already thinking ahead, calculating his next step. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back to reality. David glanced at it quickly. His assistant, sending a text. Merger docs are ready. Call when you land. The timing was almost perfect. He had a plan for when he got to New York, but right now he needed to survive the next few hours. Rachel wasn't done with him, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had to outlast her, outthink her, and stay focused. As if on cue, Rachel reappeared in the aisle, this time with a tray of drinks in hand. She moved with the same purposeful stride, eyes scanning the cabin, her blonde ponytail swaying behind her as she made her way down the aisle. She paused just a few feet away from David, her eyes flicking over him for a split second before moving on to the other passengers. But then, as if she couldn't help herself, she stopped. She turned, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Mr. Carter," she said sweetly, her tone as smooth as velvet. "I see you're still holding up well. I must admit, I'm impressed." David forced himself to meet her gaze, trying not to show how much her words were starting to get under his skin. He kept his expression neutral, his voice calm. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his words measured. "I'm just doing what I do best." Her smile widened, just a touch too wide. There was something in her eyes now, a flicker of something darker, like she knew she had him just where she wanted him. She tilted her head slightly, her voice lowering, almost conspiratorially. "You know, Mr. Carter," she said, her words dripping with sweet poison, "it's not every day we get someone like you in first class." She let the words hang in the air, heavy and laden with meaning. David's jaw tightened, but he refused to react. He knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to goad him, trying to see if he'd break. She wanted him to show weakness, to snap so she could push him even further. But he wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Not now, not ever. "Some people might say the same about you," David replied, his voice steady, matching her tone. "But I suppose first class is big enough for all kinds of people, isn't it?" Rachel blinked, clearly taken aback for a moment. She wasn't expecting him to turn it back on her so quickly. For a split second, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it was gone just as fast as it appeared. Her smile returned, but it wasn't the same. This one was colder, sharper, almost predatory. She didn't say anything else. Instead, she gave a small nod and turned to continue her rounds, her footsteps echoing down the aisle as she moved away. David let out a quiet breath, his heart still pounding from the exchange. He'd held his ground, but he knew this wasn't over. Rachel wasn't done with him, and neither were the passengers who had been watching. Every moment he spent on this plane was another moment in the spotlight. Every move, every word was being watched. But David Carter wasn't someone who ran from a fight. He had worked too hard to get here. To let someone like Rachel take away his dignity, his confidence, his place. The game was just beginning, and he had every intention of winning. David had managed to keep his composure for the last few hours, but the calm he had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to fray at the edges. The flight was nearing its halfway point, and the tension in the cabin felt palpable, like a slow-burning fuse leading towards something inevitable. He could feel it in the air, the subtle, insidious weight of everyone's eyes on him, the unspoken judgment that hovered around his every move. Rachel had backed off for now, but David could tell she wasn't done. She was calculating, always planning her next move. He knew it. He could see it in the way she observed him, like he was a puzzle she had yet to solve. It wasn't just about the seat anymore, or the briefcase. No, Rachel had made this personal, and David was beginning to wonder if she had more to gain from this game than he realized. He leaned back in his seat, trying to ignore the mounting pressure that seemed to close in on him with each passing minute. His focus wavered as the soft buzz of the cabin's chatter began to intensify. He glanced to the side, his eyes landing on the man in the pinstripe suit who had been watching him ever since the boarding process. The man's eyes narrowed as he caught David's gaze, offering a slight, almost imperceptible sneer before returning his attention to the window. The silent message was clear. "You don't belong here." David fought the urge to react. His heart rate picked up, but he suppressed the feeling, forcing his focus back to the tablet in his lap. He couldn't afford to let these distractions derail him. Not now. Not when he was so close to sealing a deal that could change everything for him. But as the minutes dragged on, the whispers in the cabin became harder to ignore. It was as if every quiet murmur and side glance was another reminder of the power struggle that was unfolding in real time. And Rachel was still lurking, her presence almost invisible but inescapable, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Then, just as he thought he might finally be able to push through the tension and lose himself in the work, he felt it, a subtle shift in the air. Rachel reappeared in the aisle, this time walking with more purpose, her eyes scanning the cabin as if looking for something specific. David didn't even need to glance up to know that she was headed straight for him. Her voice cut through the low hum of the cabin when she reached his row. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone syrupy sweet, "we've just been informed that the flight has experienced a slight delay due to weather conditions. There may be some turbulence ahead." She paused, her eyes lingering on him for a moment too long. "Just something to be aware of." David didn't respond immediately. He was still processing the way her words lingered in the air, heavy with implications. The flight had been smooth so far. There had been no sign of any delay, no mention of weather issues. So why now? Why was Rachel bringing it up? He kept his expression neutral as he looked up at her. "Thank you for the update," he said, his voice cool but cordial. Rachel's smile widened, just a touch too much. "Of course," she replied. "Just wanted to keep you in the loop. I'd hate for you to be surprised when things start shaking a bit." She turned then, her movements smooth and calculated, as though she had delivered the perfect line. But David wasn't fooled. It was another dig, another attempt to unsettle him. The mention of turbulence, both literal and figurative, felt pointed, deliberate. Rachel knew exactly what she was doing. The subtle jab wasn't lost on David. It was becoming clear that Rachel wasn't just targeting him because of some minor issue. She was trying to break him, to make him lose his cool. She wanted him to react, to show a crack in the armor. But David wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the tension slide off his shoulders. It wasn't worth it. Not today. He wasn't about to let a flight attendant, no matter how persistent, destroy his focus. But as Rachel disappeared down the aisle, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She had made her move, but he wasn't about to let her win. The rest of the flight passed in a blur, the rhythmic hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glassware being the only sound that filled the cabin. David found himself unable to fully concentrate, though, as the minutes ticked by. He kept thinking about the game Rachel was playing, the way she was trying to chip away at him, and how much further she was willing to go to make him crack. He glanced around the cabin once more, his gaze falling on the woman in the pearl necklace and the man in the pinstripe suit. The whispers were getting louder now, as if the entire plane had become an audience, waiting for the next act to unfold. David had spent his entire life fighting for respect, for the acknowledgement that he had earned his place. But in this moment, it felt like all that work was slipping through his fingers. The plane shuddered slightly, and the seatbelt sign flickered back on. David tightened his grip on the armrest as the turbulence Rachel had hinted at began to make itself known. The fastened seatbelt sign illuminated the cabin in a harsh, fluorescent light, and the murmurs of passengers grew louder as the plane rocked in the air. The air grew thick with a collective sense of unease, and David felt his stomach tighten as the plane continued to shake. Rachel's voice came through the intercom a moment later, calm and steady, offering reassurance to the passengers. But David didn't need her to tell him what was happening. He could feel it. The turbulence wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something more insidious. The fight had begun. As the plane jolted once more, the cabin's mood shifted. The subtle tension that had been building since the start of the flight was now palpable. David's grip on the armrest tightened involuntarily, but it wasn't the turbulence that had him on edge. It was the simmering feeling that something much worse was about to unfold. He had been on enough flights to know that a little shaking wouldn't be enough to rattle the passengers. But the whispers, the sideways glances, those were something different. They were beginning to feel like the turbulence of the mind, chipping away at his composure. David shifted in his seat, trying to steady his breath. Rachel's voice was still echoing in his ears, the words "slight delay due to weather conditions" dancing in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder if this was some calculated move on her part, a way to make him feel the pressure even more. The situation was escalating, and she was doing everything she could to control the narrative, to push him to the edge. But David wasn't going to let that happen. He couldn't. Not now. As the plane smoothed out, the sudden stillness only seemed to make the situation worse. The uneasy quiet settled over the cabin, with passengers now returning to their activities, some pretending to ignore the tension in the air, while others cast furtive glances his way. David didn't need to look around to know they were talking about him. The hushed tones, the glances, he could feel it. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. He had worked too hard to get here, to let some flight attendant with a personal vendetta make him feel like he didn't belong. He took a deep breath, forcing his mind to return to the merger, to the deal he was about to close. He needed to focus, to stay calm. That was his advantage. No one could take that from him. Just then, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Is everything okay, sir?" It was the junior flight attendant from earlier, the one who had been snickering with Rachel. He stood beside David's seat, looking uncertain, his eyes wide as if he had been summoned by the growing tension. David met his gaze, momentarily caught off guard. The young attendant looked nervous, almost apologetic, as if he wasn't sure if he was about to be dragged into whatever game Rachel was playing. David knew this was his opportunity to shift the dynamic, to make a move. He didn't want to antagonize anyone further, but he also didn't want to be seen as someone who could be pushed around. Not anymore. "I'm fine," David said, his tone measured. "Just dealing with a little turbulence. Nothing to worry about." The attendant nodded quickly, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "All right, sir. Let me know if you need anything." He quickly retreated, but David could tell that his presence had been more of an interruption than an attempt to offer help. Rachel's shadow hung over him, and the boy, whoever he was merely a pawn in her game. David leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the cabin again. He couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was about to escalate. Rachel wasn't going to let this slide. She had been setting the stage, testing him, seeing how far she could push. He had no intention of being the one who buckled under pressure. The plane's descent began soon after, and with it, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted once again. As the wheels hit the ground and the plane slowed, the quiet murmurs that had filled the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by the loud clanking of seatbelts being unbuckled and the shuffle of overhead bins being opened. But as the aircraft taxied to the gate, David felt the weight of the journey settling in. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him once more as he stood and retrieved his briefcase, but this time he didn't flinch. The turbulence had been nothing compared to what he had just endured. And Rachel? Well, he had no intention of letting her have the last word. Not today. The plane came to a full stop, and the seatbelt sign blinked off, allowing the passengers to begin gathering their belongings. David's grip on his briefcase tightened. He didn't know what Rachel's next move would be, but he was ready. And no matter how much she tried to manipulate the situation, he was going to make sure she wouldn't win this time. As the passengers began to file off the plane, David took a deep breath and moved toward the door. But before he could step into the aisle, he felt a familiar presence beside him. Rachel. She was waiting. David stood at the threshold of the airplane, his briefcase clenched tightly in his hand as he watched the stream of passengers disembark. The noise of the overhead bins being slammed shut, the low hum of excited chatter, and the clinking of luggage being retrieved filled the air. But David's mind was still far away. It was like he was in a different world, one where nothing felt real anymore. Just the quiet, persistent buzz of adrenaline running through his veins. Rachel was still standing in the aisle, blocking the way, a faint but unmistakable smile playing on her lips, as if she were savoring the moment. Her posture was perfect, confident, like a cat waiting for its prey to make the wrong move. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, "I see you're ready to go. I just wanted to make sure you didn't forget something." David raised an eyebrow. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he had learned enough by now to know this was just another attempt to throw him off balance. He wasn't going to let her get to him. "I'm all set," David replied coolly, his voice steady. His eyes never left hers as he stood his ground. "Oh, I'm sure you are," she said, her lips curling into a thin smile. "But you see, there's one more thing. Something I think you might have missed." She moved closer, blocking his exit, her eyes flicking to the briefcase in his hand. "That briefcase," she continued, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. "You might want to make sure you haven't forgotten anything in there. You wouldn't want to lose something important, would you?" David's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. He had a feeling that this was no accident, no casual remark. This was a game Rachel had been playing all along. She had been pushing him, testing him, and now she was trying to exploit any weakness she could find. "I'm not sure what you mean," David said, his voice firm. "Everything I need is in here. You can check if you'd like." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a split second, David saw a flicker of frustration before it was masked by the same polite, professional facade. She was trying to get under his skin, trying to make him second-guess himself, but he wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. "I'm sure everything's in order, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone now laced with a sharp edge. "But I do find it odd that you're leaving so quickly. We could have talked more. I do believe there's more to discuss." David didn't budge. He stood tall, his jaw set, his grip tightening on the briefcase. He had made it this far without letting Rachel push him off track, and he wasn't going to let her succeed now. He had a life to build, a deal to seal, and nothing, no one, was going to take that from him. "I have nothing more to say to you, Rachel," David said, his voice even but firm. "I'm done here." With that, he pushed past her, not waiting for a reply. Rachel didn't try to stop him this time, but he could feel her eyes on him, burning into his back. The door to the jet bridge loomed ahead, and David took a step forward, his heart pounding, but his resolve unwavering. As he stepped into the corridor, he could hear the faint murmur of voices from behind him, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. Not now. He had won this round. But the fight wasn't over. Rachel had made her move, and now it was his turn to take control. David walked down the narrow jet bridge with determination, his mind racing as he thought about the next steps. He had to get to New York. He had to focus on the merger. But the sting of Rachel's words, of the power she had tried to wield over him, still lingered. He wouldn't let her win. Not now. Not ever. The doors to the terminal opened, and David stepped out, his steps purposeful, his mind focused. But even as he left the plane behind, the feeling that this wasn't the end, but only the beginning, stayed with him. Rachel's game was far from over. As David walked into the terminal, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. The immediate sense of relief from leaving the plane behind was replaced with a quiet, simmering anger. Rachel had crossed a line again, but this time he knew it wasn't just about a seat, a briefcase, or some petty power struggle. This was personal. He pushed through the crowds of passengers in the terminal, heading straight toward baggage claim. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him back to the present. He pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a message from his assistant, Ethan. "The merger docs are ready. I've updated everything. I'll see you in New York." David's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. The deal, the reason he was on this flight in the first place, was still waiting for him. He had to focus. That was the one thing that could ground him now. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the encounter with Rachel. It was like she had wormed her way under his skin, and it was starting to fester. He hit reply, typing a quick message back to Ethan. "Got it. I'm headed to the office now." He hit send and shoved the phone back into his jacket pocket, walking faster now, determined to put the flight, and Rachel, out of his mind. But the whispers of the cabin, the looks from the other passengers, the way they all silently watched his every move, echoed in his ears. She had turned them against him, and that was something David wasn't going to forget easily. Baggage claim was chaotic, as usual. People standing too close, waiting for their bags, and the faint smell of coffee in the air. David stood there, scanning the overhead monitors for his luggage, but his mind was far away, replaying the last few hours on the plane. He couldn't afford to dwell on Rachel's moves, on the subtle games she had played. He needed to stay focused. Just as he was about to turn away, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart rate picking up, half expecting to see Rachel again. But it wasn't her. It was a familiar face. Ethan, his assistant. David, Ethan greeted, his smile wide but his eyes betraying a hint of concern. You made it. You good? David didn't smile back. I'm fine, he replied, though the words felt hollow. Let's just get this over with. Ethan didn't push. Instead, he handed over an envelope, the kind that carried weight. Here's the finalized merger paperwork. Everything's in order. You've got this. David took the envelope, his fingers brushing against Ethan's, his mind still caught in the fog of the flight. But now there was something more pressing. The paperwork, the deal, New York. Rachel was a distraction, but this was the prize. Thanks, David said, his voice steadier now, the adrenaline from the flight slowly subsiding. Let's head to the office. I need to focus. They both walked toward the elevators, the sound of their shoes clicking against the polished floor echoing in the quiet terminal. But even though David was moving forward, a part of him couldn't stop thinking about Rachel. This wasn't over. She hadn't finished with him, and he wasn't going to let her dictate how this story played out. As the elevator doors closed, David straightened his posture and adjusted his grip on the envelope. He had a plan. He had to. The stakes were too high to let anything or anyone get in the way. But he also knew that what he had just walked away from was only a small piece of a much larger game. And this time, he wasn't going to be the one left holding the losing hand. David entered the sleek glass tower in Midtown Manhattan with a sense of purpose. The marble floors beneath his feet gleamed under the harsh, fluorescent lights. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped inside, ignoring the glossy surfaces of the building that were meant to impress. He wasn't here for any of it, the polished brass or the meticulous design. He was here for the deal, the merger, the future of his career. As the elevator ascended, David's mind shifted gears. He couldn't afford to let the frustrations from the flight, Rachel's games, the judgmental stares from passengers, linger in his thoughts. The deal he had been working on for months was finally within reach. He couldn't let anything derail that. He had worked too hard, played the game too well, to let someone like Rachel pull him off course. The elevator dinged softly and the doors slid open to the 42nd floor. The lobby was bustling with activity, executives in sharp suits conversing in hushed tones, secretaries scurrying from one desk to another, and the occasional phone call cutting through the background noise. David stepped out of the elevator and walked briskly toward the glass doors of the conference room. He was met by his assistant, Ethan, who stood just inside the room, adjusting the documents on the table. Ethan, a man with an air of calm efficiency, looked up when he saw David enter. "You're here," he said, offering a smile. "Everything's set up. You're ready to go." David nodded, walking to the large conference table where the board members of Horizon Airways sat, their sharp eyes already fixed on him. They were all there, suit jackets perfectly aligned, ties straight, faces unreadable. They didn't waste any time. As soon as David took a seat at the head of the table, the meeting started without a word of greeting. The opening pitch was quick, as it always was. The figures were solid, the projections high, and the projections for profitability were impressive. It was everything they had worked for. As the chief strategist behind this merger, David had put in countless hours. Every detail had been refined, every potential complication accounted for. He had thought of everything. But then, as the meeting progressed, his mind started to wander. Just for a moment, the tension of the flight lingered. Rachel's words echoed in his mind again. "You wouldn't want to lose something important, would you?" That smile, that smirk. Rachel hadn't let it go. She'd gotten in his head, and David hated that. He wasn't used to losing control, especially not to someone like her. But he had to push it aside. This meeting was too important to let distractions creep in. As one of the board members, Gerald Klein, began discussing the final terms of the merger, David's focus snapped back. Gerald, the company's treasurer, was older, gray-haired, and always had a way of presenting himself as a steady, no-nonsense figure. But today there was something off in his demeanor. His eyes darted over the documents, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. There was an energy in the room that hadn't been there before, a tension that no one else seemed to acknowledge. David shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing as he watched Gerald. Something wasn't right. He had been in this game long enough to recognize when the dynamics shifted. Gerald was stalling, but why? What was he waiting for? I believe we've covered the most crucial aspects of the merger, Gerald said, looking up at David, his voice even but strained. But before we move forward with final approval, I'd like to go over a few additional concerns. David's gut tightened. He had expected this. The board had been delaying their approval for weeks, throwing up last-minute hurdles, but he wasn't prepared for this. Not here, not now. We need to address some of the recent issues regarding our image, Gerald continued, glancing at the others around the table. There have been some developments, some things we need to discuss before we proceed with the deal. David's mind raced, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew exactly what Gerald was hinting at: the tabloids, the articles, the viral headlines. He had been trying to avoid it, shutting down Rachel's petty games, focusing on the merger. But now, here it was, creeping into the very thing he had worked so hard for. "I'm sure you're referring to the recent press around me," David said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of frustration. "But that has no bearing on this deal. I've already addressed those issues with legal and PR teams." Gerald didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the other board members, a silent exchange taking place between them. The weight of their eyes on David felt like a silent judgment. "We're all aware of the situation," Gerald said finally, his voice clipped. "But the board has received several complaints, and there are concerns about how this might impact our public image. We need to be certain that you're not bringing any risk to the table." David's blood ran cold. He knew exactly where this was going. The whispers from the plane, the insinuations, had made their way into the corporate world, and now they were being used against him. Rachel had done more than just question his seat on the plane. She had planted seeds, and now they were sprouting in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I assure you, the merger is solid. The numbers are there. This deal is too important for petty distractions," David replied firmly, fighting to maintain his composure. "I've built this company from the ground up. My reputation, my work, speaks for itself." The room was silent for a moment, the tension hanging thick. But before anyone could speak again, the doors to the conference room opened. David froze. The interruption was jarring. Everyone turned their heads to see who had entered. It was a man dressed in a dark suit, holding a folder in his hand. Gerald's eyes widened as the man stepped forward. "Mr. Langston," the man said, his voice cool but businesslike, "I believe this is yours." David's stomach dropped as the man handed over the folder, and Gerald's face went pale. David knew immediately that whatever this was, it wasn't good. David took the folder, his fingers barely brushing against the smooth edges of the paper. He could feel every eye in the room on him, the silence thickening with each passing second. Gerald Klein's expression was unreadable, but David could tell that whatever was in that folder was enough to rattle him. Without wasting a moment, David opened the folder. His eyes skimmed over the documents inside, his pulse quickening as he saw what they were. It was a report, one that had clearly been compiled with precision and intent. There were screenshots, printouts, and detailed descriptions of the viral article that had painted him as a villain. The piece about the altercation on the flight, about the supposed disruption he'd caused, was plastered across the pages. The worst part wasn't the article itself. It was the carefully curated narrative that followed it. The report outlined a series of accusations, unverified claims, yet convincing enough to raise doubts. It was clear someone had gone to great lengths to make sure that his name was linked to every incident, every bit of gossip. It wasn't just a smear, it was a weapon, and someone was using it against him. David felt the weight of the room pressing down on him as he scanned the final page. It was a damning piece of information, an email thread that seemed to confirm the worst. The sender was listed as V. Creed, and the recipients were Horizon executives, including Gerald Klein. The contents of the email were as clear as day. "We need to be careful with Mr. Langston. He's a liability. His behavior on the flight should be enough to reconsider the merger. We can't afford to have someone like him in charge of the company's future." The last words burned into his mind. Someone like him. Rachel had done this. She had orchestrated it all. She had turned an isolated incident into a full-scale campaign to destroy him. And now the very people he had trusted to lead Horizon were using her words, her lies, to undermine everything he had worked for. David's hand tightened around the folder. He forced himself to look up, meeting the eyes of the board members one by one. They were waiting, their gazes locked on him, each of them silently calculating what this meant for the deal, for the company. Gerald was still silent, but his discomfort was palpable. The others remained passive, cautious, but David could sense the shifting tides. He didn't need to ask what was coming next. He already knew. "This is," David started, his voice steady despite the shock rippling through him. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign, a well-timed attack to derail the merger, and you're letting it affect your decision?" Gerald didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then back at David. The words that followed were measured but laced with regret. "David, we didn't want it to come to this, but you have to understand, the optics are bad. We can't afford the risk. Not with everything on the line." David's heart pounded as he leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. "So you're telling me that the entire future of this company hinges on a handful of rumors, a few fabricated stories? You're going to let that dictate whether we move forward with the merger?" There was a tense silence. Gerald finally spoke, his tone softer now. "It's not just about rumors, David. It's about perception. The media, the public, they're unforgiving, and we can't afford to alienate our stakeholders." David clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his emotions in check. He had come this far, built this company from the ground up, and now it was all on the line. His reputation, his work, everything. He had fought tooth and nail for this merger, but now it was slipping through his fingers. And for what? For an accusation, a lie that Rachel had spread like wildfire. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't let it. "Then let's address it," David said, his voice sharp and resolute. "Let's put this to rest right here. I won't let one person's malicious actions destroy what I've built. You're going to make this decision based on facts, not assumptions." David turned to the board members, his eyes scanning their faces. He needed to turn the tide, to show them that Rachel's manipulations were nothing more than a distraction. He wasn't going to let her win. Not here, not now. Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but David didn't wait for him to speak. "I will provide you with proof that this is all fabricated. I've already taken steps to clear my name, and I'm not going to let this company and the merger become collateral damage." Ethan, who had been standing off to the side, now stepped forward. "David's right. We have the documentation. Legal is already working on it. And once we have the evidence, we can disprove these allegations." David turned back to Gerald, his gaze unwavering. "You'll have everything you need. And once this is cleared up, we move forward with the deal. No more delays. We've worked too hard for this." Gerald's gaze faltered for a moment, but then he nodded slowly. "Fine. We'll give you the time you need to clear this up. But understand, David, this isn't just about the merger anymore. It's about the trust we have in you. If this isn't handled, we might not have a choice." David nodded, though the weight of Gerald's words still hung in the air. He had been given a second chance, but he knew he couldn't afford to fail. The next few hours would determine everything. As he stood up to leave the conference room, his mind was already working overtime. Rachel had played her hand, but now it was his turn. He had to make sure this didn't end with her winning. He couldn't lose. Not now. Not ever. The next steps would be crucial, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. David's steps echoed in the hallway as he walked toward the exit of the building. He could feel the weight of the conversation with the board still pressing on him, even as he tried to shake it off. He had been given time to clear his name, time to fight back. But the clock was ticking, and Rachel's whispers were still lingering in the back of his mind. She had made her move, and now it was up to him to counter it. The night air hit him as soon as he stepped outside, the cool breeze a sharp contrast to the tension that had been building in his chest. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and headed toward the sleek black car parked at the curb. Ethan was waiting inside, the driver's seat empty as they prepared to head to their next destination, the lawyer's office. David had a plan in place, but it wasn't going to be easy. Rachel had planted the seeds of doubt, and now he had to pull up those roots and make sure they didn't grow any deeper. As the car slid smoothly into the traffic of New York's crowded streets, David let himself think for a moment. The deal had been his life's work. He had fought tooth and nail to get to this point, and now someone was trying to rip it all away. Someone he had barely known, someone who had no idea what he had been through to get here. Rachel had made this personal. She had tried to turn the public and the board against him. But David wasn't going to let her succeed, not when he was this close to everything he'd worked for. Ethan glanced over at him from the front seat. "You've got this, David. Legal's already putting together the response. We'll have everything lined up." David nodded absently, staring out the window as the city lights blurred by. The idea of a legal response felt like a necessary step, but it wasn't the end of this. Rachel had made it clear that she wouldn't stop with just a few accusations. She would go further if she had to. She would use whatever means necessary to get what she wanted. He had to be ready for that. "Do you think it's just her?" David asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he had fully processed it. "I mean, do you think she's working alone?" Ethan paused, glancing over his shoulder before answering. "Honestly, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone else is behind this. Rachel's been pretty vocal about her dislike for you. But that email, the one she sent to Gerald, that's not just her trying to play games." David felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "I was thinking the same thing. Gerald, he's too involved. He's not just concerned about optics. There's something else going on here, something we're not seeing." "Agreed," Ethan said. "We'll find out. Don't worry about that." David leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. He knew Ethan meant well, but the situation had escalated faster than he had expected. It wasn't just about the merger anymore. It was about his reputation, his career, everything he had worked for. And it was clear now, Rachel wasn't just trying to take him down for a few missteps. She was playing a much bigger game. He could feel it in his bones. The car slowed as they neared the law office. The driver signaled to park, and David's thoughts returned to the task at hand. He needed to clear his name. He needed to expose the truth, and he needed to stop Rachel from getting any more leverage. It wasn't just about winning the merger anymore. It was about putting an end to this chaos once and for all. As they pulled into the parking lot, David looked at Ethan. "We go in hard. We get every piece of evidence we need. I want everything. The emails, the communication, whatever we can use to expose Rachel. And I want her to know that this ends now." Ethan nodded firmly. "Got it. We'll hit back twice as hard." David pushed open the door and stepped out of the car, the cool air hitting him once more. The next few hours would be critical, but as he walked into the law office, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Rachel may have made the first move, but he wasn't going to let her dictate how this played out. He had a fight ahead of him, but for the first time since the flight, David felt confident that he was finally in control again. Inside the law office, the atmosphere was much colder than the brisk air outside. The sleek, modern design of the space, gray walls, polished floors, and minimalist furniture, gave it a clinical, no-nonsense vibe. David barely registered the coldness as he walked toward the conference room. His mind was focused, sharp. It had to be. Every decision from here on out mattered. Ethan followed closely behind, glancing around the room with a level of familiarity that suggested he'd been here many times before. David's focus, however, was solely on what lay ahead. The lawyer, Carla, was already inside, reviewing a stack of papers at the table. Her reputation in the business world preceded her. She was relentless, one of the best at navigating the legal battles that came with high-profile mergers and acquisitions. "David," Carla greeted him as he entered, looking up from her papers. Her sharp eyes assessed him quickly, and David could see the usual no-nonsense demeanor. But she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She got straight to the point. "We need to move fast. I've already looked over the media coverage and the legal responses, but we need to pull all the pieces together if we're going to clear your name." David nodded, sliding into the chair opposite her. "I don't want a legal response, Carla. I need more than that. I need to show that Rachel is working with others in this." Carla raised an eyebrow but didn't look surprised. "You think this goes beyond Rachel?" David didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'm sure of it. Rachel's been very vocal about her personal issues with me. But she didn't just make this up on her own. Gerald Klein's involved, and he's not the type to act on rumors. I believe there's a bigger agenda here. Carla leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the surface. You're right to be suspicious. I've seen the email thread between her and Klein, but that doesn't tell the whole story. And if Gerald is involved in this, we need to approach it carefully. He's been a board member for too long to ignore any potential fallout from crossing him. David clenched his jaw. The complexity of the situation was sinking in, but he was past the point of doubt. He could feel Rachel's fingerprints all over this. She had started with a whisper on the plane, but now it had escalated into something far more dangerous. His career was on the line, and if he didn't stop this now, it would cost him everything. We've already got a few leads, Carla continued, her voice calm but sharp. I've contacted some of the executives who might be sympathetic to you. They'll give us access to board communications. But you're right, we need more than just words on paper. We need proof that Rachel isn't working alone. David's mind raced. What if I'm wrong? He asked, though he knew the answer. What if it's just her pulling strings? Carla looked at him with a level stare. David, when people go this far to destroy someone's reputation, they don't do it alone. There's always someone in the background, someone who benefits from the chaos. David sat up straighter, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. He had no choice but to trust Carla. Then let's go get the proof. I want everything. Carla nodded. We'll start by tracking down any unusual financial transactions. Someone had to finance Rachel's little smear campaign, and we need to see if Klein's name shows up in any of the connections. We'll follow the money, David. That's where we'll find the truth. David's chest tightened with resolve. I don't care how long it takes. We find them, we expose them, and we make sure they never think about doing this to anyone again. With that, Carla grabbed her phone and began making calls. Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice so only David could hear. You know, I've got some people on the inside too. If you need any intel, just say the word. David gave him a quick nod, his mind still on the task ahead. Time was slipping away, but every move mattered now. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The board was already looking at him with suspicion, but if he could expose the real players pulling the strings, he could turn everything around. As Carla's voice dropped into the background, David knew the fight was far from over, but he wasn't backing down. This was his company, his future. And Rachel? She would soon realize she had made the biggest mistake of her life. David's pulse raced as he sat at the conference table, the weight of the information in front of him growing heavier by the second. The document in his hand was the last piece of the puzzle. He had been so close before, so close to exposing Rachel and those backing her. But now this new detail seemed like the smoking gun he had been waiting for. The pages in front of him weren't just filled with financial transactions or emails. This was something much more direct. The paper trail he had uncovered led straight to Gerald Klein, his biggest corporate adversary on the board, and the man who had been playing the part of the loyal but cautious board member. But the documents Carla had pulled from various sources painted a different picture altogether. Klein wasn't just sitting back and letting the chaos unfold. He had been orchestrating it. The spreadsheets and the accounts in front of David showed money flowing in and out of accounts that had no logical connection to the board's operations. But when David followed the numbers, he realized that this wasn't some rogue transaction. It was deliberate, it was personal, and it was connected to Rachel's smear campaign. Ethan, who had been sitting across from him, leaned in to get a closer look at the documents. His face, usually calm, was now furrowed with disbelief. Are you telling me Klein was funding Rachel's campaign against you? All this time? David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, trying to process the enormity of it all. It looks like it, he said finally. Rachel was just the tool, the message, the face, but Klein is the one who's been making sure the fire stays lit. Ethan shook his head slowly. This is bigger than we thought. David let out a sharp exhale, his fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had suspected that there was something more at play, something beyond Rachel's petty grudge. But to have it confirmed like this, to see Klein's name tied to every accusation, every false claim about his conduct, felt like a betrayal of a magnitude he hadn't prepared for. The thing that gnawed at David now wasn't just the damage done to his reputation. It wasn't even the business itself, though the merger was still on the line. It was the realization that the man who had once been a mentor, who had shaped much of his early career, was behind this all along. The trust he had placed in Klein felt like a shattered illusion. "We need to bring this to light," David said, his voice steady, though the anger bubbled just beneath the surface. "This isn't just about me anymore. This is about the integrity of the company, and the board needs to know what Klein has been doing behind the scenes." Ethan nodded, his eyes hard with resolve. "But how do we play this? You know Klein's influence. If we move too quickly, it might look like we're just trying to deflect blame." David leaned back in his chair, thinking it through. The last thing he wanted was for this to turn into a circus. More rumors, more speculation. No, the key here was precision. They needed to hit Klein where it would hurt the most, expose his underhanded dealings without leaving room for doubt. "We gather the evidence, make sure we've got everything we need," David said, a new edge to his voice. "Then we go to the rest of the board. We lay it all out. No emotions, just facts. The way he's been operating, it's illegal. And once the others see that, they'll have no choice but to act." As he spoke, David could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no longer just about surviving a smear campaign or saving his reputation. It was about fighting for the very soul of the company. And if Klein's schemes were left unchecked, it would spell disaster for everyone involved. Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. "And if Klein goes down?" David's lips curled into a grim smile. "Then we take control. This is our chance, Ethan. If we expose him, we can not only clear my name, but we can reshape this company. We can do things the right way, with integrity. No more backroom deals." The thought of it was tempting, almost intoxicating. David had spent years working his way up through the corporate ranks, but he had always kept his hands clean. He had built his reputation on doing things the right way. And now, in the face of betrayal, he could see a path forward, a way to take control, not just of the company, but of his own future. But to do that, he would have to face Klein head-on, and the stakes had never been higher. David stood up, his decision made. He wasn't going to wait any longer. This fight was far from over, but it was one he was now fully prepared to face. "Let's go to Carla," he said, his voice a little firmer now. "We need to move fast. We've got everything we need to bring this to a head." As the door to the conference room clicked shut behind them, David felt a sense of determination settle over him. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally back in control. It was time to finish this. David walked down the hall with Ethan, each step carrying a newfound sense of urgency. The gravity of the situation hadn't quite settled in until now. They had the proof. They had the evidence. Every transaction, every piece of information they needed to unravel the conspiracy. But even with all the pieces laid out before him, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. As they reached the office door, Ethan gave him a look, a silent question, a reminder that once they crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back. Carla was already inside, her sharp eyes scanning the documents laid out in front of her, as if waiting for the final piece to fall into place. The room was quiet, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. David entered first, his footsteps heavy, his mind still racing with the implications of what they were about to do. Carla looked up from the papers as soon as he entered, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that told him she was ready for this. "You've got it then," she said, not waiting for pleasantries. Her tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation, the kind that only came when everything was on the line. David nodded, handing her the folder that contained everything they had uncovered, the financials, the email exchanges, the undeniable proof linking Klein to the smear campaign. "This is it. This is how we take him down." Carla took the folder from him, her eyes flicking through the pages quickly. She didn't need to read it all. She had already been briefed on the details. But David could see the moment when the truth hit her, when the full weight of Klein's betrayal became undeniable. "This is worse than I thought," Carla muttered, her fingers tightening around the papers. "Klein's not just involved, he's been at the center of it all, and now he's put the entire company at risk." David's jaw tightened as he stared at the evidence in front of them. "I don't care about Klein's games anymore. He's going down. We're not just going to let him walk away from this. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but filled with conviction. So what's the plan? How do we move from here? We can't just walk into the boardroom and drop this on them. We need to be strategic. David turned toward the window, his reflection staring back at him. We don't have time to be cautious. We go to the board, we lay it all out. No half measures, no playing nice. We expose Klein for what he really is, and we take control of the narrative before anyone else can. We do it now, before he has a chance to cover his tracks. Carla nodded, understanding the weight of David's words. We'll need to move fast then. Get the rest of the board on your side before this can spiral out of control. We'll have to act quickly but methodically. We can't give Klein any breathing room. David's mind was already working through the next steps. He couldn't afford to give Klein time to counter their moves, to make excuses or manipulate the situation further. The clock was ticking, and he needed to strike before Klein had a chance to rebuild his defenses. I'll call an emergency meeting, David said, his voice steady now, filled with a quiet certainty. We go in with all the facts, all the proof. No more delays. We make sure the board sees exactly what's been happening behind the scenes. As he turned back to face the room, his gaze met Ethan's. The determination in both their eyes was clear. They were in this together, and no matter how difficult the road ahead was, they weren't backing down. We take control of the narrative, or we risk losing everything, David said firmly. And this is where we draw the line. Carla picked up her phone, her fingers dialing the number for the board secretary. I'll get the meeting set up immediately, she said, as if already moving in perfect sync with David's plan. David let out a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling into his bones. It was happening. He was no longer just reacting to what had been done to him. He was taking the fight directly to Klein, and he wasn't going to stop until he had secured his place at the head of the company once and for all. As Carla arranged the details, David's mind flashed back to the moment on the plane, to the way Rachel had tried to undermine him. That moment, that small but significant confrontation, had set everything in motion. Now the battle was about to reach its climax, and David wasn't going to let anyone take this from him. Not Klein, not Rachel, and not anyone else who stood in his way. He turned back to Carla and Ethan, his voice unwavering. Let's do this. Time's running out. David stood outside the boardroom, his mind racing with thoughts of what was about to unfold. The heavy wooden doors in front of him loomed large, a barrier between the world as it was and the world he was about to reshape. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. This meeting wasn't just about the merger anymore. It was about power, control, and trust. And if he didn't handle this right, everything he had worked for could come crashing down. Behind him, Ethan paced back and forth, checking his watch every few seconds. You ready for this? He asked, his voice tight with tension. David took a deep breath, straightening his tie. I have to be. There's no turning back now. He had the documents, the proof, the damning evidence that would expose Klein and Rachel for what they were. But the question still lingered in the back of his mind. Would it be enough? Enough to sway the board, enough to take back control of his company, and enough to clear his name. Every one of them had their own interests, their own agendas. David wasn't sure who, if anyone, would stand with him once the truth was laid bare. But he had to try. The sound of footsteps approaching snapped him from his thoughts. Carla appeared at his side, her usual cool demeanor intact. The meeting's about to start, she said, her eyes scanning the boardroom doors. Are you ready to expose the truth? David nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his chest. We can't afford to fail now. Carla smiled faintly, her confidence unwavering. We won't. Not with this evidence. David turned and pushed open the doors to the boardroom, stepping into the sleek, modern space where the future of his company was about to be decided. The room was large, with a long, polished table at the center, surrounded by the most powerful people in the company. They were already seated, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism, waiting for him to present his case. At the head of the table sat Gerald Klein, his cold eyes narrowing as David entered. The man had always been a master of playing both sides, but today David wasn't going to let him slip through the cracks. He had come prepared. Mr. Langston, Klein said, his voice smooth, almost mocking, I trust you have something compelling to share with us today? David didn't take the bait. He stepped forward, setting the folder of documents in front of him. What I have to share is the truth, and it's time that all of you knew it. The board members exchanged glances, the tension in the room rising. David could feel their eyes on him, could sense their uncertainty. But he wasn't about to back down now. These documents, David continued, prove that Gerald Klein and Rachel Creed have been conspiring to sabotage both me and the company. They've been manipulating board decisions, spreading lies, and using corporate resources to fund a personal vendetta against me. David's voice was calm but unwavering. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times, and now that it was here, he had to make it count. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members one by one. I have proof of financial transactions, email exchanges, and internal communications that link Klein directly to the smear campaign. Rachel was just the pawn. They were using her to do their dirty work. The room was dead silent as David passed the folder around the table, letting each board member see the evidence. As they flipped through the pages, David saw the shock on their faces. They hadn't expected this. No one had, and it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting in his favor. But Klein wasn't going to go down that easily. He remained seated, his hands steepled in front of him. Mr. Langston, he said, his voice dripping with disdain, you can present all the evidence you want, but this doesn't change the fact that your behavior has raised serious concerns. Your conduct, your actions. David cut him off, his voice rising just enough to assert control. This is about the truth, Gerald, not about my behavior. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now it's time to face the consequences. For the first time, Klein's expression faltered. He looked around at the board members, his eyes darting between them as if searching for an ally, but none came forward. David could feel the shift in the room, the realization that Klein's grip on the company was slipping. Carla stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding. Gentlemen, this isn't just about David Langston's reputation. This is about the integrity of this company. If we allow one man's personal vendetta to dictate the future of Horizon Airways, then we've all failed. David took a step back, letting Carla's words hang in the air. This was it, the moment of truth. He had done everything he could to expose the lies, to reveal the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface. Now the board had a choice to make. Would they stand with him, or would they let Klein's influence poison the company forever? He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. The next few minutes would decide everything. The room was thick with tension as the board members exchanged looks, the weight of David's accusation hanging over them. Gerald Klein's once imposing presence was now noticeably diminished, his usual arrogance faltering as the silence stretched on. The evidence David had presented, financials, emails, and the damning link between Rachel and Klein, was undeniable. It was the kind of proof that left no room for doubt. Klein cleared his throat, his face flushed with anger, but his voice remained controlled. This is absurd, he said, trying to regain his composure. You've crossed a line, David. These are nothing but baseless accusations, and you have no idea what you're dealing with. David stood tall, his gaze unwavering. You're right about one thing, Gerald. I do know exactly what I'm dealing with, and it's time for this charade to end. He turned his attention to the board members, his voice steady and confident. You all deserve to know the truth, not the version Klein and Rachel have been feeding you. They've been manipulating you, using your trust in them to further their own agendas. It's time to put an end to that. The board members were still processing the information, their expressions a mix of disbelief and shock. The magnitude of what David was accusing Klein of seemed to finally be sinking in. One by one, they began to look at each other, uncertain but visibly questioning the narrative that had been presented to them up until now. Finally, one of the board members, a woman named Allison, spoke up. Her voice was quiet but firm. David, if what you're saying is true, then this is bigger than we thought. David nodded, his eyes locking onto hers. Exactly. This isn't just about me. This is about all of you. This is about the future of Horizon Airways. If we let personal vendettas and corporate manipulation control the company, then what do we have left? Trust? Integrity? Those are the things that make a company strong, and those are the things Klein has systematically tried to destroy. He could see the shift happening, the wheels turning in the minds of the board members. They had always trusted Klein, believed in his experience and influence, but the evidence David had provided had shattered that illusion. Klein stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous," he spat, his voice thick with fury. "You think you can just walk in here and accuse me of these things with no proof? You think you can just destroy everything I've built?" David didn't flinch. He was done with the theatrics. "This is the proof, Gerald. And if you had any integrity left, you'd step aside. We both know you're not in a position to lead this company anymore. Your actions have put everything at risk." Klein opened his mouth to retort, but Carla interrupted him, her voice cutting through the tension. "Enough, Gerald. The evidence speaks for itself. The board will decide what comes next, but you've lost your seat at this table." David could feel the shift. It wasn't just the evidence, it was Carla's words, her authority, that had finally severed Klein's control over the room. The board members were starting to nod, as if waking from a long slumber. The realization had set in that they were complicit in allowing Klein's manipulation to go unchecked. David stood tall, taking a moment to let the silence settle in. "We have a choice to make," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We can choose to stand with the truth, with integrity, and with the future of this company. Or we can let personal agendas continue to tear it apart. The decision is yours." The room was heavy with uncertainty, but the tide had turned. David could feel it in the air. The board had seen enough. The power was shifting, and he was finally taking control. A moment passed, and then Allison spoke again, her voice much firmer this time. "We need to have a vote. There's too much at stake. If what David is saying is true, then we need to act quickly to preserve the future of this company." The other board members murmured in agreement, the room shifting as the finality of the situation began to settle in. Klein's grip was slipping fast, and he knew it. His face turned redder, his mouth working, but no words coming out. He was defeated, and he knew it. David turned to Carla, who was already pulling together the necessary documents for a vote. "This ends today," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The end of the line for Klein, for Rachel, and for anyone else who thought they could undermine the company." David had fought for this moment, for control of Horizon Airways, for the future of the company, and for the chance to make things right. But more than that, he had fought for his reputation, his integrity. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. Not now, not ever. As Carla began setting up the paperwork for the vote, David knew one thing for sure. Today was the day that would define the rest of his life. Whatever came next, he would be ready. David sat at his desk, his mind racing through the events of the past few weeks. Everything had changed so quickly. The board meeting had been a turning point, no doubt about it. But as the final vote had been cast and Gerald Klein was ousted from his position, the victory felt hollow, like it was only the beginning of something much bigger. The power he had fought for was his now, but it came with a heavy price. The company was fractured. The trust that had been broken couldn't simply be repaired with a vote. He had finally reclaimed control of Horizon Airways, but that didn't mean the battle was over. The legal battles with Klein and Rachel were only beginning, and the media circus was still in full swing. David knew that what happened next would define the future of the company and his place in it. Was he simply a placeholder for the company's troubled past, or could he use this moment to reshape Horizon Airways in his own image? The office was quiet, the hum of the city below filling the silence. David leaned back in his chair, glancing out at the skyline. The view from his office was spectacular, but it was a view he had earned under circumstances he hadn't wanted. He had fought for everything, his career, his company, his reputation, and now, in the aftermath of all the turmoil, he was left wondering if it had all been worth it. "Everything's in motion," Ethan's voice broke through his thoughts as he entered the room. His usual calm demeanor was more tense today, his eyes darting to the pile of documents on David's desk. "The legal team's on it. We're moving forward with the media strategy to get ahead of any more leaks, and we've got investors asking questions." David rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in. "I know," he said quietly. "I can feel the weight of it all. The press, the investors, It's like a game I didn't sign up for. But we have to make it work, right? Ethan nodded. We've been here before, David. We're not going down now. David met his gaze, the fire in his eyes still burning despite the fatigue. I'm not giving up. Not when we're so close to turning this around. Horizon's future is in our hands. Ethan's eyes softened with understanding. We've got your back, and you've got the board's support. We just need to keep moving forward. We can't let them see us falter. The reassurance from Ethan was comforting, but David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play. The path ahead was unclear, and though he had regained control of the company, there was still the lingering presence of Rachel, and, to an extent, Klein, who weren't just going to let him walk away with the prize. I need a plan, David muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. I need to be sure we're not just spinning our wheels here. The press will eat us alive if they sense weakness. In the board, he paused, thinking. I can't let them think this was a fluke. Ethan tilted his head. What do you have in mind? David stood up and walked over to the large glass window that looked out over the city. The skyline was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, but it didn't bring him peace. He was at a crossroads, and there was only one way forward, full speed ahead. It's time we shift the narrative, David said, his voice more certain than it had been in days. We've been reactive for too long. We need to take control of the story. Horizon needs to look forward, not back. We show them that we're a company that can adapt, evolve, and thrive, even in the face of all this chaos. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You want to push the reset button, huh? David smirked, though there was no humor in his expression. Exactly. It's time to pivot. Let the press know that Horizon's future isn't defined by our past mistakes. We move forward, stronger, smarter, and ready for anything. Ethan nodded, already processing the implications of what David was suggesting. That's a big move, but it could work. If we control the narrative and get ahead of the press, we can regain the trust of the public and investors. David turned back to the desk, grabbing a stack of papers. We need to focus on the merger again. Let's get that back on track. Investors want to see results, and right now, that's what we need to deliver. The merger's not just about numbers. It's about showing the world that Horizon is a force to be reckoned with. Ethan's expression grew serious. And what about Rachel? She's not done. She's probably plotting her next move right now. David paused. He hadn't forgotten Rachel's part in all of this. Her vendetta had cost him more than just his reputation. It had almost cost him Horizon. But he wasn't going to let her win. He was done being passive. It was time to take the fight to her. Rachel will come after me again. But this time, I won't be caught off guard. I'm going to make sure she knows there's nothing left to gain from this, David said, his voice low, the anger from earlier returning. And Klein, if he thinks he can walk away from this without consequences, he's wrong. I'll make sure he's exposed for what he is, and there won't be a place for him in the industry. Ethan gave a small nod, his respect for David's resolve evident. Sounds like you're ready for the next round. David gave a sharp nod in return. This is just the beginning. We're not just surviving this. We're going to make it our turning point. He glanced back out the window at the city. The horizon was now bathed in twilight, the city lights coming to life. There was still so much work to be done, so many decisions left to make. But for the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of clarity. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. David paced back and forth in his office, his thoughts racing. There was no time to waste now. The board had made their decision, and the media was already buzzing with the news of Gerald Klein's ouster. But David knew that the real work was just beginning. The real test wasn't how he had managed to remove Klein. It was what he was going to do next. If he didn't act quickly, all of the progress could be undone. He had to secure Horizon's future. He had to secure his own. He picked up his phone, dialing Carla's number. She had been invaluable in getting to this point, and he trusted her to help guide him through the next steps. Carla, David said when she picked up, his voice steady despite the pressure weighing on him. We need to act fast. Let's start with the press strategy. I need a message ready to go that redefines Horizon. We're moving forward, no more looking back, and we need to make sure we shut down any leaks, especially from Klein's camp. Carla's response was immediate, her tone calm but decisive. Understood. I'll work with the PR team to get something out ASAP. But I think you're right. We need to focus on the future. We can't let the past hold us back. The more positive momentum we create, the harder it will be for anyone to tear it down. David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Exactly. Let's also put a plan in place for the investors. They're going to want reassurances that Horizon is stable. I want to make sure we give them every reason to believe in the new direction. Transparency is key. He paused for a moment, staring at the papers on his desk. The merger still hung in the balance, and if he wasn't careful, Rachel could find a way to derail it. She had already tried once, and David knew that she wouldn't stop. The stakes had never been higher. David, Carla's voice broke through his thoughts. Do you want to meet with the investors directly, or should we leave that to the financial team for now? David's mind worked quickly. He couldn't afford to distance himself now, not after everything that had happened. He needed to show the investors that he was fully in control, that he had a clear plan to take the company into the future, and that he wasn't afraid to make the tough decisions. No, I'll meet with them myself, David replied, his decision final. I'll be ready for that. And Carla, I also need you to dig deeper into Rachel's connections. If she's working with Klein, we need to know exactly who else is involved. This goes beyond just us. We need to stop her before she has a chance to do any more damage. Carla paused, her tone turning more serious. You think Rachel's connected to more people in the company? David's jaw tightened. I don't know yet, but we need to find out. This isn't just about her personal vendetta anymore. She's got too much to lose, and if she can't take me down, she'll go after Horizon. She'll use anything she can to destroy it. He could hear Carla's voice on the other end, her resolve clear. I'll start digging right away. We'll uncover any connections and make sure we're ahead of her every step of the way. David exhaled, feeling the weight of his responsibilities pressing on him. Thanks, Carla. Let's make this count. We're not just fighting for Horizon's future. We're fighting for the future of everything we've built. The time for playing it safe is over. As he ended the call, David felt a new fire ignite within him. The battle for Horizon was far from over, but he was no longer just reacting to the chaos around him. He was in control, and it was time to take the fight directly to Rachel, to Klein, and anyone else who dared to challenge him. The next few days would be crucial. The board was still watching, the media was waiting for the next scandal, and the investors needed to be reassured. But David wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and he had a plan. He stood up from his desk, looking out the window at the city below. There was something fitting about the view. So much potential, so much opportunity, and yet it was always changing. Horizon could either adapt and thrive, or it could become a casualty of greed and manipulation. David wasn't about to let it be the latter. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy. But then again, nothing worth having ever was. As he gathered his thoughts and prepared for the whirlwind of meetings and decisions ahead, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. The game had changed, and now it was time to play it on his terms. No more playing defense. It was time to take back the narrative, and this time, no one was going to take it from him. David stood in the center of the boardroom, feeling a rare sense of calm despite the storm brewing all around him. The final board meeting that would determine the fate of Horizon Airways had arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. Every eye was on him, and he could sense the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. But today, it wasn't about surviving the accusations or playing defense. It was about winning, about reclaiming everything that had been stolen from him. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members. Some of them were still skeptical. Others were waiting for him to prove that the company could still thrive under his leadership. But there was a new sense of determination in David's chest. He had fought too hard to let this moment slip away. The door to the boardroom opened with a quiet creak, and Carla stepped inside. She had been the one behind the scenes, working tirelessly to build the strategy that had finally put David in this position. He could always rely on her, and today would be no different. Everything's set, Carla whispered as she walked up beside him, her voice low but confident. We have the support we need, and the investors are behind you. This is your moment. David nodded, trying to push aside the nagging doubts in the back of his mind. Rachel was still out there, and though Klein had been removed from the board, The damage they had caused couldn't be undone overnight. But David wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let their manipulation dictate the future of Horizon. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice steady as he turned toward the long conference table. As he made his way to the front of the room, David felt the eyes of every board member on him. The silence was deafening, but he welcomed it. This was his chance to speak directly to the people who held the power to determine Horizon's future. This was his chance to prove that the company could recover and move forward with strength. He cleared his throat and began. "Thank you all for being here today. As you know, the last few months have been a time of unprecedented challenges for Horizon Airways. But I stand before you today, not to dwell on the past, but to look ahead, to look at the future we can build together." David paused, letting the words settle. He knew the board had their doubts, but they also had their fears. Fears that if Horizon didn't make bold decisions now, the company might slip further into chaos. And that fear was something David could use to his advantage. "We've made it through the worst of it," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And while I won't ignore the mistakes that have been made, I am here to tell you that we are stronger for having survived them. What we've learned over the past few months is that Horizon Airways has the resilience to overcome anything, if we stick together and focus on the right path forward." He could feel the board members shifting in their seats, some nodding, others still hesitant. But David had their attention. That was the first step. The door to the boardroom opened again, and this time, it was a member of the legal team, carrying a thick folder. She placed it on the table in front of David with a quiet nod. He looked down at the folder, then back up at the board. "Inside this folder," he said, "you'll find everything you need to know about what's happened behind the scenes. The manipulations, the lies, and the conspiracy to undermine my leadership. It's all here. I know it's been difficult to trust the narrative that's been presented to you, but this evidence speaks for itself." David slid the folder across the table toward the board members. He knew what they were about to see. Documents, emails, financial records that would tie Rachel and Klein directly to their schemes. The proof was undeniable, and once they saw it, there would be no turning back. He could feel the tension in the room building as the board members began flipping through the pages. "Rachel Creed and Gerald Klein have been playing a dangerous game," David continued, his voice unwavering. "They used their influence to manipulate, to sabotage not just me, but the future of this company. And I'm not going to let that stand." As the last board member finished reviewing the evidence, David let the silence hang for a moment. The weight of the decision in the room was palpable. They knew what had to be done, but how they reacted would determine everything. Would they side with the truth, or would they continue to allow corruption to poison Horizon? Finally, Allison, one of the board members who had been vocal in her support of David from the start, spoke up. "David, I think it's clear that we have no choice but to move forward with a new direction, but we'll need a plan. We'll need to show the public and our investors that Horizon is still a company worth investing in." David met her gaze, his resolve firm. "The plan is already in motion. We have the support of the investors, the legal team, and the public relations team. It's time for a full reset. We're going to move forward with new leadership, a renewed focus on innovation, and a commitment to transparency. Horizon will be stronger than ever." There was a moment of silence, and then the board began to nod in agreement. Slowly, one by one, the board members spoke up in support of David's plan. The momentum was shifting, and David could feel it. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had believed in Horizon, who had believed in its potential. He wasn't just reclaiming control of a company, he was reclaiming his legacy. But even as the board voted unanimously in favor of David's plan, a part of him couldn't help but wonder. Was this really the end of the battle, or was it just the beginning of a new war? Rachel had been quiet since the board meeting, but he knew she wasn't finished. The fire that had driven her to sabotage him in the first place still burned in her eyes, and David wasn't naive enough to think she would just let go of her vendetta. The real challenge was still ahead. As the meeting continued, the board's unanimous support felt like a fleeting victory. David could feel the weight lift slightly off his shoulders, but it was only temporary. The challenges ahead were still looming large. Rachel and Klein might have been removed from the equation, but the scars they left behind were deep. Horizon Airways had been shaken to its core, and now the real work of rebuilding began. Once the vote was concluded and the board members began filing out of the room, David stayed seated for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. Carla, standing off to the side, caught his eye and gave a subtle nod of approval. He appreciated her calm presence. Throughout this whole ordeal, she had been his steady anchor. "Good job," she said softly as she approached him, her voice a quiet contrast to the thunderous applause echoing in his mind. "The board believes in you, David." He nodded but didn't immediately respond. The moment felt bittersweet. Yes, they had won the day, but the real challenge lay ahead, restoring Horizon to its former glory. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. The damage done, both publicly and behind closed doors, was considerable. They had their work cut out for them. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the now empty conference table. "It's not enough," he said finally, his voice steady, though it carried a weight of determination. "The hard part starts now. We have to show the world that we're more than the drama. We have to show them Horizon's future isn't defined by what happened in the past." Carla sat across from him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You're right. But with the media frenzy around you, the past might not let you go as easily as you'd like." David let out a sigh, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I know. That's why we need to start taking control of the narrative. We don't just respond to the press. We create the story. It's the only way to move past this." She gave him a knowing look. "That's the plan I've been working on. The PR team has already drafted a strategy. We'll target both the press and the public with a campaign focused on rebuilding trust. We'll highlight the steps we're taking to strengthen the company, starting with transparency and integrity. The investors will need constant reassurance, but the public will need something more. Something that shows Horizon is moving toward a brighter future." David's mind raced as he absorbed her words. "And the merger? We're still pushing forward with that, right? If we can finalize that deal, it'll give us the financial foundation to move forward." Carla nodded. "The merger is still on track, but we have to be strategic. With all the media coverage, the other company is waiting to see what happens. If we're smart, we can present this as a turning point. Not just for Horizon, but for the entire industry. It's not just about surviving, it's about being the change we want to see." David felt a surge of resolve. This was what he needed to hear. It was time to stop thinking of the challenges as insurmountable and start seeing them as opportunities. Horizon's future wasn't doomed by the past. It was a blank canvas waiting to be painted. "We move forward," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We make sure the world knows we're stronger than ever, and we show them exactly how it's done." Carla's eyes gleamed with approval. "That's the mindset we need. Let's start pushing out our first message. Focus on the employees, on the people who make this company great. Let the public know Horizon isn't just a name. It's a commitment to innovation, to integrity, and to rebuilding what was lost." David stood up, a new energy coursing through him. "We've got work to do. We'll need a roadmap for the next few months, clear milestones so we can track our progress. I don't want any more surprises. We need to anticipate everything." Carla got to her feet as well, her expression reflecting a rare spark of excitement. "I'll get on it immediately. We'll prepare for a major press release and start drafting an internal communication strategy to rally the team. And I'll keep you updated on the merger. We'll make sure everything goes smoothly." David gave a small smile. "Perfect. Let's make this happen." As Carla left the room to begin implementing the plans, David couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like he was finally in control. The company might have been shaken, but it was still standing, and now it was up to him to lead it back to greatness. As the day wore on, David found himself reflecting on how far he had come. There were still so many unknowns. Rachel was still out there, plotting her next move, and Klein wasn't going to just vanish without a trace. But David had proven that he could fight back, that he could come out on top, and now he was determined to finish what he had started. There was one thing he knew for sure. Horizon Airways wasn't just a company, it was his legacy, and no one was going to take that from him.